Hello, everyone. My name is Hussain Jasani, and I head South Asian Studies at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. I'm happy to welcome you all to the second lecture in a series entitled Unexplored Sources and Uncharted Territories. As part of this series, we try and bring to you speakers who have identified and studied sources that have not been explored so far by other researchers studying the topic. We hope that their analysis of these hitherto unidentified sources will result in the audience getting new insights into some uncharted territories and undocumented histories. Our speaker for today is Professor Shenila Khoja-Moolji. We also have Dr. Sana Iqbal, who used to be the research associate at the South Asian Studies here in London, who now serves as the research consultant for the South Asian Studies on call. Dr. Iqbal will introduce Professor Khoja-Moolji and then conduct the proceedings for the day. She will engage with the speaker of today's talk. But before I invite Sana to take over, let me quickly introduce Dr. Sana Iqbal. Dr. Sana Iqbal holds a PhD in cultural geography from the Coventry University in the UK. Her doctoral research was embedded at the intersection of socio-cultural expressions of Muslim women's agency and spatial injustice in the context of South Asia. As I said, she was part of the South Asian Studies. She served as a research associate in South Asian Studies till very recently, till she recently moved to Germany. So let me invite Dr. Sana Iqbal to take over. Sana.
Thank you so much, Hussain, for a very kind introduction. It's my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest, Professor Shenila Khoja-Moolji, who is the Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani Associate Professor of Muslim Societies at Georgetown University. As many of you might already know, that she is an interdisciplinary scholar with research interest in the fields of Muslim studies, feminist theory, South Asia, and migration. Professor Khoja-Moolji is also the author of award-winning books, which include Forging the Ideal Educated Girl, the Production of Desirable Subjects in the Muslim South Asia. Her detailed profile is also available in the description of this video. Professor Khoja-Moolji, we are extremely delighted to have you with us today to present some of the key findings from your recent work with us. So now I'm going to hand it over to you so that you can share your invaluable insights with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iqbal, for the introduction and for making the time to read this book in advance. I also want to begin by thanking the South Asian Studies Unit at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, in particular Hussain Jasani, for this invitation. I'm really excited for this collaboration with the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne. For our time today, I'll speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we can have Q&A. So this project was inspired by my grandmother. In 1971, Nani, along with my mother, who was 12 years old at the time, had to flee East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, due to a civil war. Nani was already a widow at the time, caring for 5 young children while working at a restaurant. The war, as can be expected, jolted this family, which was always on the cusp of poverty. But when Nani and her family landed in Karachi, members of the Shia Ismaili community formed a web of care around them. They were first taken to a refugee camp that was set up in a jamat khana, which is a Ismaili space of worship and gathering, and they were given food and clothing there. Hot meals, 3 hot meals, as my mom emphasizes to me. An ad hoc volunteer committee composed of displaced Ismaili people themselves had come together to help other displaced families. Members of the committee helped Nani find housing and subsidized the family's rent for over a year. The image that you see here on the right is of the building where my grandmother and her family lived, 6 people in a studio apartment. I took this image in 2019 as I was conducting field work with the apartment's current occupants, Ismaili refugees from Afghanistan this time, also being supported by the Ismaili community. The volunteers also helped enroll my mother in an Ismaili-run boarding school and provided tuition fees for several months. In this photo, you see my mother in the white hairband at the back, along with other Ismaili girls who were asked to stay back to attend summer school so that they could learn the Urdu language. In the meantime, an Ismaili woman helped my grandmother find work as a housekeeper for another woman. The lives of displaced working-class Muslim women like my Nani, a widow with 5 children, engaged in the informal economy, working as a domestic aide, always on the brink of falling deeper into poverty, are often not recorded within national or even religious histories. And also excluded from our histories is the labor of everyday women who supported displaced co-religionists. It's not that these women are forgotten. They're indeed remembered and celebrated by family members. But they have not yet entered the official historical record of Ismailis. It was this potential loss of women's history, recognizing that their lives and community building effort would disappear unrecorded and unarchived, that motivated me to write this book. Relatedly, I also wanted to highlight the efforts of displaced peoples themselves in rebuilding their communities. Most studies about displaced people narrow in on the resources that the state or other agencies provide to them, or on the contractual relationships between states and dislocated people. The tasks of biological and cultural reproduction, mutual aid, and spiritual care, often performed by women, are comparatively absent from studies of resettlement. In the book, therefore, I highlight such ordinary care work and its connection to religion in fashioning refugee emplacement. My over 90 interlocutors fled East Pakistan and East Africa in the 1970s due to civil war and expulsion. Even though they were separated by thousands of miles of land and sea, they share ethnicity and religious tradition. They are Shia Ismaili Muslims who trace their ancestors to the Sindh-Gujarat corridor. Shia Ismailis are a historical religious minorities. They emerged from a succession crisis following the death of Prophet Muhammad, when one group of the Prophet followers allied behind his friend Abu Bakr, and they would eventually be called the people of the Sunnah and the community, or Sunni, and a smaller group sided with his son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and would consolidate over time into the party of Ali, or Shia. The Shia over time split into further groups as divisions developed over rightful successors. My interlocutors belong to the Nizari Ismaili group of Shias, who today are estimated to be between 12 and 15 million in number and spread globally. Their present Imam, or spiritual leader, is the 49th Imam in direct succession from the Prophet. From the 11th century onward, the Nizari Ismaili Imams, located first in Egypt and then in Persia, sent out missionaries to various regions, including to the Indian subcontinent. A 15th century missionary conferred the title of Khwaja, Persian for Lord or Master, to a group of his Indian followers, which over time modified to Khoja. Over the course of the centuries, Khojas migrated from Kashmir and Punjab down the Indus River Valley to the Sindh-Gujarat corridor and settled there. They engaged in subsistence farming or worked as petty traders and farm laborers. Epidemics and famines in the region in the late 19th century weakened the economic prospects of the community there, and greater numbers of Khojas headed to urban centers in India or to the Gulf and Swahili coast. This was, of course, also facilitated by new railway lines within India and increased commercial activity in the Indian Ocean. Later, during the 1940s and 50s, some of these Ismaili families, like my Nani's, relocated again to escape the violence that accompanied the partition of India. They headed to East Pakistan. So by the 1970s, we have a sizable number of Ismailis in East Pakistan and East Africa. And unfortunately, now they had to move again due to civil war between the East and West wings of Pakistan and Idi Amin's expulsion of Asians from Uganda and general anti-Asian sentiments in other parts of East Africa. These Ismailis made their way to West Pakistan, today's Pakistan, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada in particular. I interviewed women who belonged to this cohort. I asked them about their lives and the memories they have of their mothers and grandmothers to understand the broader role that women have played in maintaining religious sociality across generations and across continents. In the book, I ask, how do people survive dislocations? How do they remake their social and spiritual life worlds? What types of material, cultural, and emotional work do women in particular undertake to regenerate a sense of self and community? What can a closer examination of women's activities teach us about lived ethics, the formation of religious communities, and about practices of care? The book tries to make at least two key interventions. Its first intervention is in relation to how we study refugee placemaking. Studies about refugees often focus on contractual relationships between refugees and states, or when considering placemaking, we learn about how refugees transform their built environments, particularly public spaces, so that it reflects their needs and aspirations. Viewed from this lens, diasporic Ismailis have carved their place along migratory routes by establishing jamat khanas and social welfare institutions. But I extend the concept of placemaking beyond the construction of physical infrastructure to include the ordinary acts of care that sustain connection among people and to ideas. Ideas such as, what does it mean for one to be an Ismaili? What does it mean for someone to be part of a religious community? I argue that it is through everyday actions, cooking for a lost traveler, helping a young widow set up a shop, telling a miracle story, passing on a heritage food recipe, that Ismaili women have iterated community. And here I'm informed by Vered Amir and Brian Allen, who have suggested that while religious community is a repository of meaning and a marker of identity for many people, it is not a given, that we have to explain how a community is empirically formed. And so in the book, I focus on the case of displaced women to notice how the Ismaili community is made and remade in the here and now, but also symbolically. The second offering that I make is in relation to how we can look at women's practices, and by looking at them, we can discover the lived dimension of the Ismaili faith. In addition to prayers, which are often the focus of Muslim piety, we encounter women enacting their faith through mundane reproductive activities. These are care activities through which they not only express their faith, but also try to work out what their faith or deen actually is. Placemaking after displacement then becomes a scenario for me to theorize in Ismaili ethics of care. Let me give you a quick broad arc of the book, and then I'll share one specific example. After introducing the book, in the second chapter, I traced the childhoods of the women I interviewed and their memories of their foremothers to reconstruct their lives and forced migration. This older story of Ismaili migrations is often told from the perspective of empire, celebrating Ismaili men who thrived in the colonial political economy. I instead home in on women's everyday lives to show how they reinforced communal affinities while cultivating ethical sensibilities. How Mitibai Premji of Mombasa and Taj Bibi Abu Ali Aziz of Dar es Salaam took in boarders from smaller towns so that they could attend school. How Shirbanu Lalani kept one box for religious dues and another one for household expenditures so that money available for religious dues doesn't get mixed up with money for soap. And how Ismaili women grappled with the directives of their imam when he asked them to drop the faith veil. I then move on to accounts of how Ismailis fled East Pakistan and East Africa. These include traumatic experiences, from witnessing killings while fleeing under the cover of night to surviving on ketchup packets on days for end. But women also remembered the generosity of strangers and co-religionists. I have captured some of these episodes in the book so that my readers can understand how the effort of placemaking that they will see in the later chapters, it flows beside stories of these trauma and hardship. In this image, we see Umida Switlow with a bag that she carried when she left Uganda alone as a teenager. Chapter 3 examines women's efforts to create and sustain Jamat Khanas, Ismaili places of worship and gathering across generations, first in East Africa and then in North America. It introduces women who created makeshift Jamat Khanas at their apartments in Atlanta and Fort Wayne. In addition to the practices of laying down bed sheets so that community members could sit on the floor, or trimming the legs of a coffee table to make it resemble a pot or a table that's used for rituals, placemaking included reciting dua, burning agarbatti, and sharing food. Ismailis conjured the sacred sensorium of the Jamaat Khana even during flight, on steamboats and at refugee camps, by reciting ginans, participating in religious classes, and celebrating religious festivals. Chapter 4 outlines placemaking through mu'jiza or miracle stories. I include stories of miraculous rescues as Ismailis were trapped in Jamaat Khanas, as well as unexpected aid from strangers during the early years of resettlement. These stories reinforce faith in God's and Imam's protective care. Their retelling not only memorializes a shared past, but also shapes the future spiritual state of the Ismaili community. In Chapter 5, I examine cookbooks written by 3 displaced Ismaili women from East Africa, through which they introduce readers to histories of community life in India and East Africa, pass on heritage food recipes, and even share the Imam's advice on nutrition. Chapter 6 explores placemaking in the second generation. These are the daughters of my primary interlocutors as they now engage with communal pasts, simultaneously interrogating and celebrating a shared history in novels, artwork, and dissertations. Having grown up in North America, this generation articulates an Ismaili ethics of care that is informed by their ancestors, but also intersects with locally manifest concerns around anti-brown and anti-Black racism, and engages in a critique of settler colonialism and the model minority paradigm. Overall, then, the book draws on a specific cohort of Ismaili women and their ordinary practices of care in the context of displacement to tell a broader narrative about religious ethics and spiritualized socialities. I will now take you through some pages of the book so you get a flavor for it. And this is from Chapter 3. In the late 1960s, as anti-Asian sentiments were on the rise in Tanzania, Gulzar Qasim saw her chances of progressing in her career as a gynecologist diminish rapidly. She therefore considered leaving. With a couple of other Ismaili women doctors, she decided to take a test that could lead to medical residency in the United States. She passed and was accepted into a program at Emory University, and in 1972, together with her husband, Bahadur Qasim, Gulzar made her way to Atlanta. Through a contact at the Emory Library, Gulzar connected with 2 other Ismailis in the area, and they decided to get together at Gulzar's place. Gulzar recalls in an interview with me, "We thought maybe we should meet every week, and maybe we should probably do dua together. And we all got excited about it. And we said, fine. RK was a great cook, so she would cook, and I would be her helper. And then every weekend we would meet." While initially this gathering only included Gulzar's immediate family and a couple of other Ismailis, they were soon joined by another 4 students who had moved to Atlanta. Gulzar describes this first congregation of 12 people. "We all said dua and tasbih, and then we would have our dinner. And mind you, we were not all very religious or anything. We have evolved a lot. But at least we knew about getting together and having food and doing, saying our prayers together." Here, Gulzar mobilizes a different meaning of being religious, one that conjoins performing prayers with commensality and community, positioning this practice of religion against understandings that might limit it to the domain of formal prayers or exclude social life from its ambit. Iqbal Paru, then a student at Georgia State University and a member of this small congregation, remembers looking forward to those gatherings as a chance to enjoy Indian food. Gulzar would cook biryani and samosa, so I would say I am coming. And she even used to pack food for me to take home, so I always had food for the next day. It was the only good food that I got. They, Gulzar and Bahadur, really took me under their wings. As more Ismailis arrived from East Africa, the makeshift Jamaat Khana moved to another congregant's apartment. Gulzar and Qasim were then officially appointed as its faith ministers. In 1973, several refugees from Uganda joined this small congregation. These members wanted more for their Jamaat Khana, a larger space and daily services. The Jamaat Khana thus moved to another location, a house on Lisbon Street, and that's the image that you see here. Gulzar recalls that while the request for daily morning and evening services came from the patriarchs of the Ugandan refugee families, it was actually their wives who did the work that kept the Jamaat Khana running. Quote, "One person would be in charge of cleanup and do everything. We vacuumed every time after Khani. They would vacuum. It was mainly done by women, like food offerings and all that stuff. So that really created the environment that we were used to traditionally. And in fact, whoever came early did the agarbatti. We always had agarbatti. So we ran the Jamaat Khana as a very formal place, and the women basically kept it clean and went on with the traditions." Gulzar's recollections shows how the seemingly quotidian activities of preparing food offerings, vacuuming, cleaning, and burning incense, just as they had in East Africa, evoked imaginings associated with the Jamaat Khana. As geographer Phil Hubbard has suggested, place emerges as a particular form of space through acts of naming, as well as through the distinctive activities and imaginings associated with that particular space. For the newly transplanted Ismailis in Atlanta, burning agarbatti was a sensory reminder of Jamaat Khanas in East Africa. It transformed a repurposed house or a storefront into a spiritual place. Thus, women's seemingly quotidian activities maintained spiritual connection and fashioned a continuity of traditions, as Gulzar's words remind us. Meet Roshan Pirani. After fleeing Chittagong in 1971, Roshan spent 2 years in Karachi working at a hospital while trying to enter medical school. She was, however, denied admission because she was not considered a local. So she convinced her older brother, who had already left for the United States, to arrange a visa for her. In the US, still not able to pursue a medical degree due to visa restrictions, she pivoted to a career in radiology and headed to Fort Wayne. When Roshan arrived in Fort Wayne in 1973, there were a few Ismaili families there from Uganda and East Pakistan, as well as several young Ismaili men studying at local area colleges. For the first 6 months, Roshan organized an informal Jamaat Khana in her apartment, and in the following year, the Ismaili Council officially appointed her as faith minister of that Jamaat Khana. She remained a faith minister for the next 9 years, hosting the Jamaat Khana in her apartment for the first 2 or 3 years. My interview with her reveals not only how she transformed her living room into a sacred space, but also how she kept the community together through feminized forms of care. Roshan remembers the specific changes she would make to her living room every Sunday to convert it into a Jamaat Khana. Quote, "So in the living room, I would pull all my furniture aside, vacuum, place white chadars down on the floor, and use curtains to separate the area. 2 members of the congregation purchased center tables and cut the legs a little shorter, and that was our pot. So we would lower the pot, and that's how we made the Jamaat Khana." Like Gulzar, Roshan explained how she carefully replicated every ritual that is performed in formally established Jamaat Khana. "I really tried to make the environment as Jamaat Khana. When it's dua time, it's dua time. We literally had all the ceremonies." Roshan recalls that they even recited the specific Ginan called Anantakaro that signals to the congregants that prayers are about to commence, acting as a transition from common to sacred time. On festival days, Roshan cooked for dozens of congregants. Like Gulzar, she would freeze some food to send home with the young men who attended services. The chance to eat home-cooked Indian food would make these men, quote, so happy that they would literally come to Jamaat Khana just so they could have these food offerings. Although young single men received these gifts of food as partly in secular terms, the chance to re-encounter at home the aroma and taste of the same foods shared recently in connection with prayer services also extended the reach of the sensory experience of Jamaat Khana and the reproductive labor that women like Roshan dedicated to it. Establishing makeshift sacred spaces, according to cultural geographer Rhys Jones, entails a negotiation between sacred acts and profane settings, challenging the established notion of sacred space as absolute space. We see Roshan and Gulzar challenging the idea that space is absolutely sacred or profane, asserting through their actions that by adapting sacred conventions, they can temporarily and repeatedly make their living rooms a space where the sacred can transpire. Scholar Pareen Mawani argues that the experience shared in the Jamaat Khana, the atmosphere created therein, cannot be reconstructed in any other place. Even as a temporary construction, the Ismaili Jamaat Khana is a material site within a boundary. In this sense, as Mawani suggests, the Jamaat Khana is physically distinct and a salient Ismaili infrastructure of worship and care. But because God is omnipresent, any space carries the potential to be transformed into a threshold between mortal and eternal worlds. Specifically, the sensorium of the Jamaat Khana can be conjured, shared, and transmitted by and through a collective of Ismaili practitioners. Thus, while I agree with Mawani that the Jamaat Khana carries a distinct quality as a physical site, I also suggest that we consider the potential for this sacred space to exist separate from fixed dedicated structures, as we have seen in the makeshift Jamaat Khanas of Atlanta or Fort Wayne, and indeed to exist separate from any physical structure at all. The soothing fragrance of incense, communal recitation of ginans, bodies collectively falling in prostration or swaying in zikr, and commensal eating are the auditory, visual, and bodily acts and rituals through which practitioners can summon the sensory structure of the Jamaat Khana, even outside its material boundaries. We see this on board a ship leaving Chittagong for Karachi. Many of my interlocutors remember scrambling to pack their bags in April and May of 1971 and making their way to the dock, hoping to escape the riots that had broken out in Chittagong. They were headed for the Shams steamer. As expected, ships leaving the city were packed, food and water ran short, with shortages exacerbated further by a journey that was longer than usual, 12 days instead of the usual 8 days, because the steamer was not allowed to cross Indian waters and ended up briefly lost at sea. Passengers were sick and vomiting. Adding to the inevitable anxiety about heading into an uncertain future, women were further distressed because their spouses and adult male children had remained behind in Chittagong, either hoping to sell family possessions before leaving or simply because there were so few seats available on the steamers. In these tumultuous times, the predominantly Ismaili and predominantly female passengers of the ship would invoke the divine through collective and communal prayers and through expressions of care for each other. Roshan Pirani remembers, every day we would do our dua, tasbih, ginan. Ginans are hymn-like poems of varying lengths, often recited during formal congregation services. They have a central role in Ismaili religious life and rituals and are considered texts through which the peers conveyed teachings of Islam. Ginans thus have a didactic or doctrinal purpose, along with acting as a medium for communication with the divine. Roshan recalls seeing women crying and often soothing themselves by reciting ginans. Another Ismaili woman who fled in the same steamer as Roshan explains, the chanting of the ginans created an atmosphere that comforted us, like a Jamaat Khana. Roshan also recalls the presence of 2 itinerant preachers among the passengers. They not only provided pastoral care, but continued to hold the religious classes that they had offered back in Chittagong Jamaat Khana. Roshan had been their student, and now these onboard classes provided her an unexpected sense of continuity. During these tense moments, Ismaili women also reinvigorated already familiar forms of commensal eating and care to sustain community. J.A. recalls that she had received news from members of the Jamaat who had left on an earlier ship that food would run short, so she and 4 of her friends cooked dry snacks to share with everyone. The sensory and somatic dimensions of religious experience have long been recognized in the study of religion in South Asia. Srinivas posits religion as also an experience of the senses and argues that while there is no single sensorium of the sacred, it is possible to identify elements of experience that are historically shared by a group of practitioners. Such a sensorium tied to memories of places and bodies can connect practitioners of a shared tradition to each other and to a collective past. On board the Shams steamer, singing the Anand Akharo Ginan under the stars on a wet and crowded deck, paying attention to a wise and sharing chevro, united the passengers in their memories of Jamat Khanas in Chittagong, reinforced their bonds to each other and belief in divine intervention. Many of my interlocutors described these ordinary placemaking activities as seva. Seva is a Sanskrit word used to express devotion and service to a supreme deity with whom the devotee has a personal relationship. The term is used by contemporary Ismaili Muslims of South Asian descent to denote service to the Imam, as well as to individuals and institutions in the Ismaili community and beyond. When I asked J.A. about why she uses the term Seva to describe her work on a Jamat Khana cleaning committee, she explained, Seva is good works that are a form of prayer. Seva is Sreva. She then proceeded to explain this wordplay to me by reciting a verse from a Ginan in which the term Sreva, which means to worship, is used. Eji kahore jivata me kis karan aaya ji, na kiti sahib ji ni Sreva ji. O man, if you did not worship the Lord, then say, why have you come? J.A. appears to understand Seva as broadly equivalent to ethical conduct, which in turn is recognized as a form of worship because it's anchored in a consciousness of the Lord. Many Ismailis also understand Seva as opportunities given by the Imam to elevate or polish their souls. In doing so, they evince a mode of religiosity where good actions are directed not just by personal intentions or niyat, but also made possible by the Imam. We thus observe the limits of human intentionality as space is made for divine agency, which arrives via the Imam. Consider my interview with Khurshid Bimani. Khurshid arrived in New York City from Tanzania in 1971. In the months that followed, she built a secure position for herself at her new job, helped fellow Ismailis obtain legal documentation, and organized outings to give members of the community a chance to get to know each other. Khurshid then went on to serve on numerous Ismaili institutions over several decades. During our meeting, she described her expansive and extensive work as Seva. When I asked her about what Seva has meant to her, she says, a blessing. She then mentions a directive or a farman of the previous Imam, Sultan Muhammad Shah, in which he had said, when I am happy with somebody, I give Seva. When I am happier, I give them more Seva. Even though a believer's intent is considered a defining element of Seva, Khurshid's reference to this farman shows that she received the Seva also as a favor from the Imam. Agency for pious effort, then, does not rest solely with the individual, but emerges in a dynamic relationship between the Imam and the Murid. Because Seva is offered by the Imam, women told me of moments when the Imam eased the difficulties they encountered during their volunteer work. At the time Gulzar was serving as lay minister or faith minister of Atlanta, she was also a full-time hospital resident. She would rush home to Jamat Khana, she would rush to the Jamat Khana, still in her work clothes, to perform her duties, with no time in between to rest, change, or eat. Another woman who also served as faith minister tells me of being so tired at the end of the day that she would, quote, fall on a pile of clothes and sleep right there. But then she said, upon entering the Jamat Khana, her tiredness would just disappear. My interlocutors explained this transformation to me by using phrases such as the barakah or blessings of Seva, or feeling Maula's hand on my shoulders, or an invisible bubble around me. These phrases point to a metaphysical source intervening and guiding women through the difficulties of their volunteer service. But not all women used the emic term Seva when they were describing their care practices. One of the women I spoke with, Leila Datu, described her activities at a transit camp in Italy, such as looking after elderly Ismaili women and taking care of a baby when her mother had passed away, by insisting that she undertook this care work, quote, because we were Ismailis. In Leila's case, we see how an ethos of care becomes lodged in subjectivity. She did not have to qualify or explain it. Indeed, as philosopher Anne-Marie Moll argues, in care, qualification does not precede practices, but forms a part of them. In this sense, Leila's care for fellow Ismailis was the means through which she simultaneously discovered, expressed, and practiced her Ismaili subjectivity. Ismaili moral codes in these instances become manifest through mundane care activities in the flow of everyday life, where qualification is not deemed crucial. Cleaning an elder's bedpan and looking after a baby become tasks that one does as a matter of religious identity anchored in an ethos of care. We helped each other. We were Ismaili, as Leila insisted. In the book, then, I look at these instances to theorize an Ismaili ethics of care. While my thinking on ethics of care has been shaped by feminist theorizing, I look to the zone of religion for additionally morally compelling pathways to care and to the practice of collective social life. When my interlocutors explain the motivations for their actions, the Imam's farmans on unity of community and support of its members appear as salient sources of guidance in addition to Ginans and the Quran. The Ismaili sociality that I describe has a strong collectivist impetus, in part due to the central authority of the Shia Imam. It is helpful here to understand that obedience to the Imam is a key tenet of Shia Ismaili spirituality. When the Imam urges his followers to support the weakest members of the community, to be united, to show generosity, to engage in mutual care, the statements are understood as directives and not optional practices, as my interlocutor, Dilshad Sadruddin, repeatedly emphasizes to me. When a farman comes from the Imam, that's it, you must follow it. This allegiance unites all Ismaili Muslims worldwide. I therefore read my interlocutor's practices as expressing an ethic of care for a community that is uniquely Ismaili in its motivations, if not necessarily in the service tasks that it motivates. This is not to say that my interlocutors rationalized all their actions by reference to Islam. Indeed, other sources of moral guidance, encounters with other religious traditions and practitioners, or the gifts or sympathetic words received from a neighbor also have a place in framing Ismaili women's ethical practices. The idiosyncratic dimensions of everyday living also influence them. It is helpful, therefore, to understand Ismaili ethics practiced by my interlocutors as not delinked from everyday life, Indic intellectual traditions, and other moral frameworks, but as instead intersecting with them as sources for reflection and action. Recognizing this dense landscape of moral guidance does not preclude observing that certain pronouncements, such as the Imam's farmans, take discursive dominance in many of my interlocutors' lives. What this broader approach offers is a possibility of recognizing Islam as an overwhelming presence in women's lives, while not reducing everything they do to a single explanatory framework. I should also note that at first glance, many of the activities that we have discussed thus far, cooking, cleaning, washing, vacuuming, for example, seem to reinforce women's gendered participation in Ismaili religious life. But we can acknowledge that women performed different services than men in Ismaili settings, and at the same time recognize that women's services were meaningful ways through which they enacted devotion to the Imam and the community. As one of my interlocutors commented after we had finished vacuuming the Jamat Khana and were exhausted, quote, Women like us who clean the Jamaat khanas are a means or a zaria for the spiritual development of others. Our hard work facilitates everyone's prayers. So in that way, we get the barakat of all those who pray in the Jamaat khana. Writing about Hindu women's religious labor in the kitchen, Anandita Ghosh argues that while such spaces may indeed be gendered, and the associated division of space and labor can bolster male privilege, women can also subvert and create their own socially specific meanings of that space. Through such work, women may acquire a very private space, be relieved temporarily of the burdens of their everyday life, and be in direct and private communion with God. Such private spaces and personal meanings emerged among Ismaili women too. Women gained valuable experience through service, which at times enabled them to achieve economic independence from their husbands. One woman, for example, was able to start her own cafe at a cinema based on knowledge gained from organizational work at Jamaat Khana. Women also found personal autonomy away from the watchful eyes of their in-laws. Numerous women spoke of service as affording them religiously permissible social opportunities. Before closing, I should note that paying attention to women's contributions does not, of course, deny men's contributions to fostering sacred spaces in those early years of settlement. While women did most of the cooking, men set up the tables, took out the trash, and lifted heavy pots. Men's tasks, as Gulzar calls them, included leading ceremonies, delivering sermons, driving congregants to and from services if no public transportation was available, and engaging with the US council officials. The acts of care that men performed looked different from those performed by women, mediated perhaps by prevailing and historical gender roles and norms. At the same time, men have had access to a much wider range of service opportunities beyond the physical tasks associated with reproducing the Jamaat Khana in a new space. Men could hold leadership and decision-making positions, first as lay ministers of Jamaat Khanas, and then as the Ismaili community institutionalized its social governance work in the councils and other administrative bodies that took on this oversight. Women's participation has been comparatively circumscribed, with certain leadership positions available to them contingent solely on their relationship to men. Despite these constraints, women have always found a way to serve the Jamaat. There's so much more that I could say, and I hope that you'll read the book, but I'll conclude by zooming out and commenting broadly on the contributions that I hope this book makes. First, when the history of Ismailis is written, it's often from the perspective of the imams, the missionaries, or elite men. While these histories have accomplished the crucial task of clarifying the broad sequence of events defining Ismaili history, I add new dimensions to it through a partial reconstruction of Ismaili women's lives. Second, often women's placemaking activities take the form of reproductive tasks such as cleaning, cooking, and washing. Even though such work is necessary for the propagation of society, it is frequently viewed as a property of women's biology and is thus undervalued. Marxist feminists have therefore regarded housework as a paradigmatic site for gendered exploitation and have sought to elevate its value by moving it into the realm of waged labor. I instead align with those feminist and religious studies scholars who refuse to reduce women's work to productivist logics. I mobilize a different logic altogether, viewing women's reproductive activities as producing relationality and sociability, repairing past trauma, functioning as a means of harnessing spirituality and furnishing intergenerational continuity. The challenge for me then is to emphasize the salience of this work and those who undertake it, while also pointing out the circumstances and scenarios when it becomes a site of exploitation. Finally, the role of religion in migrant and refugee placemaking remains underexplored. In fact, in relation to Muslim refugees, Islam is often mobilized to further demonize them. I, however, show a different side of Islam, where Islam offers resources to women to not only find solace and comfort during a difficult time, but it is also a code of conduct that helps them to suture their lives and communities back together. In this respect, I note that there is an ongoingness and ordinariness to women's ethical conduct that extends beyond current analyses of Muslim charity and religiosity, which are, as Amira Mittermeier observed, dominated by the hegemonic paradigm of self-cultivation. Ismailis practice their deen both by working on themselves and working intersubjectively to create community. Of course, such modes of religious intersubjectivity are not distinct to Ismailis. Muslims globally engage in ethical community making. But unlike other Muslim groups, within Ismailis, the Imam acts as a centripetal force that gives this community a distinct route to ethical action. Identifying an Ismaili ethics of care is not to argue that the community's particular understanding of spiritual obligation honed in the diaspora is wholly distinct from modes of care developed in other communities. It is rather a close examination of one manner of living a Muslim life in which members of other communities or the scholars who study them may identify points of commonality as well as difference. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I must say that listening to your presentation was a very enriching experience for me, especially
thank you.
Because you have brought to light some of these placemaking activities and the practices of religious labor performed by displaced Ismaili women who are by no means ordinary, but have not received enough attention in the popular imagination and thought. And I found it very interesting how you have engaged with somewhat conflicting ideas of power dynamics, inequalities, and privilege that sometimes, hinder community building efforts to trace the history of Ismaili spiritualized sociality. So it's truly commendable. I do have a few questions for you. And my first question is more of a general sort of interest in how this book was shaped or written. Because there's so much information in the book and you have engaged with so many interesting themes and insights. And therefore, it would be very interesting to learn what the research process was like. How did you plan or design this research? What outcomes did you envision? And how were the decisions regarding research methods being made? And of course, how did your insider-outsider perspectives intersected during the whole journey?
Thank you for this question. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, the project actually started as I tried to focus on the life of my own grandmother. And so years ago, informally, I had started doing oral history interviews with her. I learned about some of the ways in which Ismailis fled East Pakistan, how some of them came on flights, but others were on steamers. And so that sort of story was the one that I wanted to archive, and I wanted to write that story. And so when I formally started to think about doing this work, of course, snowball sampling through my grandmother was the first way in which I started to figure out who was in her circle. So for example, the chapter in which I speak about the steamer that left Chittagong, I basically asked women who else was on the steamer with you, right? And so I think it was very interesting around how I was able to interview multiple women who fled at the same time on the same steamer as well. And so I think snowball sampling was one of the ways in which I tried to figure out who would be my interlocutors. And then as I started to focus on the women who arrived in North America, I discovered that they were engaging in sort of remaking their community with women who had fled East Africa. And so that was one of the hints for me to then actually include East Africa in my primary cohort as well, because these women ultimately come to North America. And in the early years, they are actually in these makeshift jamat khanas together. And many of them, since they share ethnicity and religious tradition, they found childhood friends in jamat khanas. There's one story in the book where a woman where two childhood friends from Gujarat had separated. One moved to East Africa and one moves to East Pakistan. And then in Fort Wayne, they meet in the makeshift Jamaat Khana decades later. And so there is that sort of connection that was happening. And so in terms of thinking about my research, I decided to include both of these cohorts, not to flatten their differences, but to keep their differences in tension, but also to show how they come together after decades. In terms of research design, it was primarily interviews with my primary interlocutors. I also included interviews with men to get an understanding of the early sort of jamat and the institutions that we're developing. In terms of archives, I looked at the early Ismaili magazines that are actually in the special collections of the Institute of Ismaili Studies, but also a lot of material that is not archived. So women shared photographs with me. They shared private journals, letters. Some families had members who had written a biography of some of their older like grandmothers, for example, which were only family biographies for circulation within family, but then they shared those documents with me as well. And so I had to kind of curate an archive that wasn't there, which was quite frankly also like a privilege to get to see all of this material as well. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Yeah, and how about your own sort of,
yes,
positionality? I mean,
yeah. So I'm very explicit in the introduction, and then also in the fourth chapter in terms of my positionality. I align with those scholars who think of all research as subjective, and in fact believe that an insider's perspective can help us sharpen our interpretations. And so I was able to, I think, and I hope, I was able to understand some of the concepts that women were invoking because of our shared history and my history in the community, right? So there's sort of a collective story that I am part of. And I think that also allowed me to furnish some sort of interpretations to what women were telling. And so in a way, it gave me that sort of privileged insight, I would say. And so it was very helpful. I did face certain dilemmas being an insider. So for example, thinking about the racism, anti-Black racism that was expressed by Ismailis in East Africa. And so I had to kind of sit with that and to understand, how do I situate the community's anti-Blackness in relation to their own positionality as settlers in this part of the world. And so since you've read the book, you will see that I situated within the context of British racial colonialism, right? And so I think those were moments where I had to sit, and I also had to, of course, I wanted to be true to my research, to my respondents and the space, but also be able to not flatly call them racist, but to also situate Ismaili ancestors in their own historical context of being part of a racial project where the British ensured that the colonized do not engage in any sort of alliance and solidarity practices. And so anti-Blackness was actually part of the British racial capitalist project. And so I had to kind of outline that in the book. Yeah, so it's been an interesting journey that way.
Yeah, thank you for unpacking the journey and the process for us. You have already shed light on the role of oral tradition in the transmission and continuity of the religious authority of women, especially women like Bachi Bai. I'm quite interested to hear your thoughts on female agency and their role in the transmission of religious traditions and community ethics. So especially, in the presence of patriarchy or elite Khoja man, how did these women navigate and exercise their agency?
Yes, and so thank you for that question. And so I think one of the things that I am trying to do, hopefully, in the book is to show that women have been part of religious communities all along. They have been transmitting their values, their ethics, perhaps through modes and methods that don't actually, that aren't read as expressions of agency or transmission of knowledge, right? So women are, of course, not writing books, the books that would become part of archives and would be read as transmission of religious doctrine. But as you yourself mentioned, the case of Bachibai, but many other women in chapter 2 who are like the women who are taking in young girls and young boys as boarders in their homes so that they could go to school. These are the women who are then responsible for also taking these kids to the Jamat Khana, giving them, teaching them ways of how to take out funds from your pocket money for religious dues, right? They are the ones who are actually doing the ordinary work of trying to think about what does faith and deen look like in the everyday. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do in the book is to highlight some of these women because they've been doing this all along. Like even in the case of cookbooks, for example, some of the women explained to me around how the choices they make in terms of what they will use and what they won't use is based on the guidance of the imam. The imam might have prohibited lal mirchi or red chilies, and so they don't use it either. Or women, all of the cookbooks that I studied include recipe for sukrit, which is a ritual food that's used in Ismaili congregations. And so all of these women are also passing on to the next generation, here is the recipe for how you made sukrit, right? And so they've been doing this work all along. And so I think it's by focusing and switching our vantage point to look at the ordinary life, to look at some of these care works, to even re-theorize how we think about agency not simply as an expression of loud dissent, but agency as an expression of reproducing one's minoritized community in the aftermath of displacement, right? That we can then see the contribution that women have always been making.
Yeah, wonderful. So my concluding question is really more about engagement with the book. So how can young students of community studies, especially Ismaili studies, but also migration and gender studies benefit from the book? How do you envision that they can engage meaningfully with what you have produced?
So I think for young Ismailis, this is hopefully, and I have had multiple readers say this already, this hopefully is a way, this book kind of expands their understanding of their own community's pasts and the historical trajectories. It brings women, it writes women into sort of a collective understanding of the community in terms of who we are, where we've been, who have been people who have been responsible for the sort of intergenerational transmission of community. I think generally, though, my hope also is for us to look at placemaking beyond that sort of focus on the built infrastructure, to move into domains that are perhaps intangible in some ways, care, mutual aid, spirituality. These are domains that are really important for the reproduction of a sociality here and now, but also symbolically. And I think those are important spaces where we will see women participating, particularly women like Ismaili women, but also say Palestinian women, right, who don't have a fixed anchor of home, but who are trying to kind of create a sociality that's transnational in some way too. And so I'm hoping that we can take the book and look at some of the ways in which we can track displaced women's agency and efforts themselves, so that we can see how a spiritualized sociality is made and remade practically, but also symbolically.
Yeah. I mean, thank you so much for a very stimulating discussion. I might have more questions, but in the interest of time, I would like to invite Mr. Hussain to share his concluding remarks and a vote of thanks. Over to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. What an exciting discussion. I mean, I wish we could continue for a long, but we need to bring this to the close for this time, and do hope to get Professor Shenila Khoja-Moolji again. For me, I think this whole discussion on insider-outsider dilemma for a researcher is a big thing, because I also study Ginans, and I belong to the tradition where the Ginans are part of their devotional ritual practices. So yeah, that's an interesting discussion there. Thank you. Thank you for those questions, Sana. It was brilliant. Let me formally thank Dr. Khoja-Moolji for capturing the history of displaced South Asian women from East Africa using some unexplored sources, including the oral traditions of these women. I must say that I have come across some autobiographical works of South Asian Gujaratis who migrated to East Africa and South Africa and later to Europe and Canada. But this is the first time that I have heard such a nuanced account of their experiences. It was good to hear you, and I look forward to reading the book as well. I'm sure this will encourage many of our viewers to pick up your recently released book as well. To our audience, Dr. Khoja-Moolji's new book is titled Rebuilding Community, Displaced Women and the Making of Shia Ismaili Muslim Sociality. All the best, Shenila, with this new release. Thanks once again for joining us today. My gratitude and thanks to Dr. Iqbal for your time and engaging with Dr. Khoja-Moolji on her recent monograph. Dr. Iqbal, you've done some amazing work on gender-related challenges in the context of South Asia. And having you interact with Professor Khoja-Moolji made the conversation more insightful and interesting. So thank you for being there. Please accept my appreciation and gratitude for taking time out of your busy schedule to collaborate with the South Asian Studies Unit at the IIS on this project. I take this opportunity to thank my director, the director of the Institute of Ismaili Studies, Professor Zain Qasim, for her guidance and support. Our deepest appreciation to Asif Murji at the Council for Canada for his timely technical assistance and editing this video. I thank the communications team at the IIS for their help in arranging the premiere of this video. For our audience who are not familiar with the lecture series, a quick introduction. As part of this series called Unexplored Sources and Uncharted Territories, we plan to invite scholars who are involved in studying Muslim societies and cultures of South Asia and South Asian migrants across the Indian Ocean region using some unexplored sources. We'll soon announce the third lecture in the series using our usual communication channels. Before we end this video, I must express my gratitude to our audience, to you all, for watching this conversation and request you to share this video with anyone who you think can benefit from this conversation. Thank you for the same. Thank you, Shenila and Sana, for your time and this exciting conversation. Have a nice day. Thanks once again.
Thank you.
Okay.